Hello and welcome to this interview with the filmmakers of For Love or Money, Film for Discussion and We Aim to Please. My name is Dwyer. I'm the director of BRAZEN Hussies, which has come out this year in 2020. I'm also with Margot Nash, who made We Aim to Please with Robin Laurie in 1976 and is one of the filmmakers of For Love or Money from 1983. We have Jeni Thornley, who was one of the collective filmmakers of Film for Discussion and also stars in it from 1973 and was one of the filmmakers of For Love or Money in 1983. McMurchy, one of the filmmakers of For Love or Money and a very established film producer. And Martha Ansara, who directed Film for Discussion in 1973, and all four of you were members of the Sydney Women's Film Group. Is that correct? Or Sydney Women's Film Collective?
No, Margot was in Melbourne then.
No, I joined when I got up to Sydney. So yes, I was.
Oh,
later.
sorry.
Yeah,
sorry, I'd left.
Yeah, Sydney was Film and FFW at the end. Yeah.
The Sydney Women's Film Group was formed in 1971. Is that right, Martha?
I think so.
Yeah. Okay, and I just want to acknowledge before we start that I'd like to acknowledge that we are all speaking today on what is and what will always be Aboriginal land. I'm currently on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri and Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation, and I would like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And I would also like to recognise the continuing connection of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples to their country. Martha, I wonder if you can tell me a bit about how and why the group was formed. If you can cast your mind back to the exciting times in the early 70s when women's liberation was forming in Australia.
Well, Jeni might remember more than me, but
a blind leading the blind.
We really believed in forming groups, I'll say. And so when we made this film, and it was followed by other films, we had to distribute it. And so naturally we formed a group. And also there was a workshop, you see. And out of that workshop in 1973, came a whole lot of films made by women, which was a phenomenon at that time. And
you mean
so they had to be distributed.
In the 1974 Women's Film Workshop.
Was it 74? Okay, yeah.
Yeah, that's okay. But I just wanted to add to that, Catherine, that when I came up to Sydney from Melbourne in 69, I met Martha at the tail end of that year. You've got to remember that for me, the broad context was not yet an established women's movement. It was actually the anti-war movement that I was active in. And also we were living under a conservative government, and it had been a conservative government ever since I was born. I worked that out not so long ago. I'd only lived under a conservative government till I was, in the late 60s. And when I went to the meeting, it was actually a meeting when I met you, Martha, as I recall. I might be wrong, but it was a meeting of activist women in the anti-war movement who wanted to come together to organise around getting the Whitlam government, getting Whitlam into power, getting the Labor Party into power after 27 years of Conservative rule. And at that meeting, I met Martha for the first time and a whole group of, I won't go through all the names. And after that, we had a subsequent meeting about forming a Sydney Women's Film Group.
Well, we had a meeting about forming Sydney Women's Liberation.
Sydney Women's Liberation.
And we met at your sister's house in Edward Street.
In Balmain, yeah.
And so we got together with other young women our age, and we formed the Glebe Sydney Women's Liberation Group in Glebe Point Road.
But it was very much part of that whole social movement of the time.
Absolutely.
It wasn't a pre-existing women's movement. There wasn't.
There was a lot of theatre making going on in the anti-war movement and protest theatre, and I just wonder what drew you to filmmaking in your activism?
Well, are you asking that of each of us would answer that in our own unique way?
Oh, I'm just wondering what, I mean, I think the Sydney Women's Group is marked by the fact that a lot of the early members of Women's Liberation in Sydney became filmmakers. And I know that, I mean...
No, they didn't. There was lots more that never...
There was lots more.
Film, but we happened to be, really interested in film, and Jeni was an actor, and, so we got together to do it.
I think it's really fantastic, the footage in the film, Catherine, of Jeni and Martha and the Sydney Women's Liberation Group. That footage of the consciousness raising groups and the discussions in that group, I think it's so fantastic. And I really think the way that you kept digging in the archives and finding more and more footage, when we were doing For Love or Money, I thought we'd found everything that there was to find, and then you went and kept finding all these other things. And I think that footage is very memorable for me, watching Brazen Hussies of Sydney Women's Liberation. I mean, my trajectory into feminism was different because I was in Melbourne, but similar too, insofar as it was the anti-war movement and performance work. Rob and Laurie and I were both actors, but I got involved in the moratoriums. I lived in Adelaide in the late 60s, early 70s, and I was doing street theatre in Adelaide during
I've seen an ASIO photo of you.
I know you've seen an ASIO photo. But that, I think for me, and I don't know about Jeni and Martha and Megan, but the activism that came out of whether you're doing theatre or street theatre or whatever during the moratorium period, it energised us to ask questions. I was very challenged by some of the discussions that we were having during that time, that were about pacifism, activism, armed conflict, all of those things are very challenging discussions. And then the gender stuff, and that was really challenging. But I think it was that early moratorium stuff that got us thinking outside of the box that we'd grown up in. And
see, also that war, the Vietnam War, interesting that we weren't involved in the anti-Korean War movement.
You're too young.
No, but even to actually know about it, and even to link it when we became active against the Vietnam War. But I just wanted to say, when I was at university at Monash in the late 60s, or through the mid-60s, the whole campus was in complete breakdown and revolt. I mean, they were amazing places. I mean, classes were cancelled. There were sit-ins everywhere. People were on strikes. It was just this time of enormous ferment. And as Margot says, everyone was asking questions. Like, you were just starting to kind of really examine colonialism, and feminism was just beginning to kind of... Someone gave me a copy of Simone de Beauvoir's Second Sex. I'd never read it. I didn't know that French women hadn't got the vote till after World War II. Like, everything was kind of like a foment of action and reaction and fighting and discussion. And the campuses were just split down the middle. It was
I was in Queensland, where there was more violence on campus than I think virtually anywhere else in the country, because it was under Joe Bielka-Peterson, and it was a police state effectively. So anti-war protests at that time were quite challenging events, because often he would sool the coppers onto demonstrators with a lot of violence. And that was the sort of hotbed that I came out on. It was quite different, I think, from Sydney and Melbourne at the time. And my perspective at that stage was the analysis of US imperialism that was being promulgated on campus, and that led quite a bit later to feminism. I mean, feminism, in my recollection, was not a phrase or a word that had come to the surface when I was at university. It was all about the war.
And I just want to say that I actually had been a teenage pacifist and used to meet with little groups and was involved with the Quakers. And so I was very strongly committed.
I just wanted to say that it wasn't just an external movement of dissent.
No, right.
Internal movement of dissent.
Yeah.
I want to give one example that deeply affected me even by the time I came to meet Martha and we became involved in Film for Discussion. You can see the layers of that in the film within the family conflict at the dinner scene. But for instance, my brother was an anti-conscriptionist activist and refused to register for national service. My father kicked him out of home because he refused to register. My brother had the NLF flag on his bedroom wall. My father stormed into the bedroom, tore the flag off the wall and said, "No son of mine refuses to go to war." And he kicked him out of home.
And what Jeni is saying is also quite important in understanding the women's movement of the time. It caused a lot of conflict, because it was new ideas that just smashed up against the old ones. And because, of course, when you're young, you're very hot-headed and you know that you know, and so we would proclaim all these things. And I remember my mother later said, "Oh, I just thought there were a bunch of silly college girls," she said. And she later stood up. Yeah.
Well, I mean, you've all raised some really interesting points there. What you were saying about being on campus at Monash, and it was such a radical time. It's so interesting that Monash's architecture has changed to decrease the ability for students to organise in that way. So, I think that's really interesting. And in terms of being in Queensland, Megan, I mean, I think you could really make a film about the Queensland women's movement, because when I was there at the Fryer Library researching, the photographs and the documentation of what was going on in Queensland, they really were so much more violent and intense than what I found in other cities. And
it's really different in that way, I think.
Yeah, the police brutality was just awful. And
extreme.
But there was also in the US, there was Kent State University, there were the police going killing people. I mean, it was such an intense time, and we were very affected by those events that were happening internationally.
Look at Paris.
That's right.
Talking about it.
Yeah. Yes. And I think while we were very involved with all of those activities, we were also coming up against the kind of sexism that we didn't call it sexism at the time because we didn't understand, that word wasn't around, but we were coming up against.
We created it.
It was created. We were coming up against brick walls, and we hadn't been able to articulate. And I remember I told this story, and it didn't end up being in BRAZEN HUSSIES, unfortunately, but where my first real connection to women's liberation was when my boyfriend, who was a sort of Marxist academic, had come back from America, and he said, "Margot, are you interested in, I think you might be interested in this." And he gave me a pamphlet from The Witches, which was the Women's International Terrorist Conspiracy from Hell. And the Witches had gone and demonstrated outside at beauty pageants, and they demonstrated, they'd picketed outside bridal shops, and they were so outrageous. And I just went, yes, that makes sense to me, because I'd had all those questioning about, did I want to do what my mother did? No. Did I want to get married and end up in a marriage like my mother had? No. Did I want to parade my body, in that way? No. I sort of knew in my heart I didn't want to do that, even though, of course, we all did. And so that kind of started another line of questioning, I think, for me. And not long after that, I bought Germaine Greer's book, The Female Eunuch, when I took it with me when I went overseas, and I left it on a bus in India somewhere. But those kind of questionings about women's role, women's place, started to happen at the same time. And, it was fantastic that you, Kate's speech on you had that in the film. And did you recreate that voice?
That was me doing the speech.
That was fantastic. I bought it. I thought it was really good. I thought, no, they must have recreated it. But it was I wasn't there, of course. I was, in Adelaide or Melbourne or something. But she spoke to those men from the anti-war movement, and spoke for women. And I think we all started to raise those questions, and that's what happened in the consciousness raising groups, of course. And then we started to make films about it.
Yes, well, as you say, late in 1969, when we formed Sydney Women's Liberation in Glebe, we actually dissected our lives, if I'm right, Jeni, and we found all these things that you're talking about. And we actually made a little presentation on January 15th, 1970, about the things that we discovered about women's lives and those very things that you're talking about. And that was such a motivation but it was also so difficult because we wanted to, we wanted the things that people were supposed to want in the olden days before late 60s.
I have a question that relates to that, Martha, but I just want to say the witches were in the American film I worked on, She's Beautiful When She's Angry, and there's a wonderful hex they did on the University of Chicago in which they said, knowledge is power through which you control my mind, my spirit, my body, my soul. Hex.
So this is like the Extinction Rebellion people, way out. Full on.
Yeah, they were hexing the male-dominated education institute. In now what you were saying about forming early women's liberation in Sydney, I want to link what you were saying to consciousness raising and film for discussion, because film for discussion was a way of using consciousness raising. Would you say a tool for consciousness raising?
The way we arrived at those scenes was through discussing our lives. Jeni, do you remember the lamb chop? The mother always says, no, I don't want the lamb chop, the last lamb chop. Those kinds of things that we observed in our lives. And then we let loose this psychodrama, which at times we had to stop. It became so violent, actually.
Really?
Yes. And that was the way we made those scenes. It wasn't, it came out of the consciousness of the actors and
Jeni,
all of us put in input.
Yeah, Jeni, I wonder if you can talk about it as the character that you play in Film for Discussion.
Well, yeah, it's very complex stuff, isn't it, really? Looking at yourself now, looking back on who you were then, what were you performing? Were you performing? Were you being yourself? I think all those questions are implicit in that so-called performance. And I think that's what psychodrama is, when you put real people and some actors, like the woman who plays the mother and the father in the family scene were actors with new theatre. But Joan, who plays my mother, she was pretty much being herself. Martha, as I recall, we set up that dinner sequence just as she would have always cooked dinner for her family.
In her house?
In her house, in her kitchen. And it's sort of almost filmed like a documentary. Really, it's filmed like a documentary, like something out of a Kathy Come Home, or, like it's got that kind of reality about it. It's very real. And I think that who I become in the film, or who I am in the film, is actually how I was at the time. I was very confused. I even in the consciousness raising groups of women's liberation meetings, I actually was extremely intimidated in those meetings. I could rarely speak often because the meetings were dominated by women who had very strong, loud voices, and I didn't. So I just used to sit by a lot of the time and observe and listen and think. I mean, they were great. I'm not demeaning those consciousness raising meetings. They were great, but they had their leaders, if you like, and I was not a leader. I was passive, I was quiet, I was withdrawn, I was shy. I was actually, and I've mentioned this to you already, Catherine, as in hindsight, I was having my own form of breakdown and I didn't know it. So when Martha films me at the mirror in that long take, or we film the family dinner, I mean, that stuff's real. That was going on. That's how I felt. I had no idea how to really live my life. any longer. And I think that's what we're saying about that moment in history, where because we'd challenged everything, the way forward was really terribly uncertain, because you were giving up a road that your own mother had walked down, her mother had walked down, her mother before her had walked down, unless you came from one of the very rare families with a very radical feminist mother. Well, I didn't. So it was extremely confronting to sort of take that step out of that road and say, I'm not going down that road. So I think that those scenes in Film for Discussion are incredibly real.
And the thing about it is, I'm sitting here in the Film Archive, and I just want to say that thanks to the formation of the Film Archive in the early 80s, we have those films. Because you see, if you're making a film of history, such as Brazen Hussies or Women of Steel, you can't get those sort of that footage made from within, except through the films that people have made. And luckily, we have the Film Archive. And there's a lot that could be said about that. But, you know, with Women of Steel particularly, to have material about what used to be called working class women and migrants is very rare, very rare.
And that's parallel as well to when we began research on For Love or Money. I mean, we were actually beginning research. Well, the archive didn't exist. We worked in the National Library at that time. The film collection was there. We had to read what Stoller calls against the grain of the archive to find representations of women, working women, that were in the film.
As I recall, Jenny, there was no, when we started going through those indexes at the archive, there was no heading women.
No.
You just had to stab in the dark under categories of work. Where might you find pictures of women working? And then as we moved on to look at feature films, we had to screen everything and, in a sense, look into the corners of each scene to see the maids in the background or the girl at the railway station. I mean, it was an incredible kind of fine-grained search because there were no guidelines in existence.
And it was also original research. I remember one of my favourite stories about For Love or Money is Madame Lamoureux. Remember Madame Lamoureux, who it was a Fox Movietone News. It was called Come Up in Sequins sometime, and was the model in the beautiful sequin dress, and the dresses were made by Madame Lamoureux
from the early 30s.
Yes, and Jeni and Megan tracked her down.
Yeah, wow.
And where I didn't go, I wish I had, and visited her house. And she said, oh, I've got something in the cupboard they gave me. And she went to the cupboard and she came back with a roll of 35mm offcuts. And she handed them. And this came to me in the end. And you know what was on that roll? You know what had been cut out?
The women making.
The women in the workroom.
Yeah.
The women who were going blind doing that sequin work.
That's incredible.
Glasses that thick anyway. But it was that sort of sweaty palms moment when you go, oh, this is what we're looking for. The stuff that's been removed and it's not important enough. And to
incredible.
us, it was the most important thing. It's what we were looking for. It was so exciting.
But that's also why the films that you got from the filmmakers, from Margot, you know, from Film for Discussion, that goes inside the personal. Whereas news footage, you do have to look hard. You can find things, but not really. And so the preservation of those films has been so important, and to use them is one of the things that makes Brazen Hussies so good.
I love
definitely. I mean, the fact that you became filmmakers and you're feminist filmmakers and creating this body of work that I could access was absolutely invaluable, you know, and it's not made by mainstream press, which is never a true depiction of women's lives, certainly. And the interior life that you're talking about, those shots of Jeni and Brazen Hussies are incredibly powerful, and I think perhaps maybe a bit confusing because they're so beautiful and she's acting, but they're like a documentary, like a document of Jeni's actual story.
They're also perhaps a bit confusing because of the nature of the equipment at that time. You know how people run around with cameras on their shoulders? There were very few of them. And to shoot sound like that, you put the camera in a big blimp, which is like a huge diving bell. And it's really heavy. And so it's on a tripod with wheels, and you can hardly move it. We did, but
wow.
You know, it wasn't easy. I know, you know, I'm so glad that we made those films, because there's 3 of the films that I was involved in, believe it or not, in Women of Steel. And there's how many of our, you know, all those films in Brazen Hussies.
I just wanted to make, picking up from Martha's point as well about the role of the archive in preserving these films, and how a film like Brazen Hussies or For Love or Money, we couldn't have made, Women of Steel, we couldn't make those films without the existence of the archive. But I wanted to just acknowledge the work of historians who certainly informed For Love or Money, all of the women historians at university who had become feminist oriented in their research and writing. Their work really informed our research before we even went to the archive. And similarly, the film historians, someone like Andrew Pike, he'd recently published his book, The History of Australian Cinema. It was his PhD. And I remember my original research when I first went down to Canberra with For Love, starting on, it wasn't called For Love or Money, then it was called the Women in Work film. I sat in Andrew's office at Canberra University, ANU University, and read his PhD, which was still moving towards publication as the book. And that's when I think Megan and I developed the paradigm that actually what we had to do was basically look at every feature film and every documentary film that had ever been made and that was written about in Andrew's book as our original primary research. And similarly, if you looked at the work that Rachel Perkins undertook with First Australians, you'll see that that body of research that's in First Australians and in For Love or Money is also based on the work of the historians. So it's sort of like the work of the archive and the work of the historians form this incredible nexus with each other, and they're all, it's such essential work for filmmakers to begin to work from that as well.
And that what Jeni has just described is actually the same paradigm that we worked with in our little office in the Women's Warehouse, where Jeni and I sat side by side for I don't know how many years, constructing the script for Love and Money in 2 columns. One was visual, and that was comprised of all the clips, the hundreds of clips that we looked at and had made notes about, and organising those into an historical timeline with selections of images that could illustrate certain arguments that were being developed at the same time through the text column. And over in another corner of our office was Margot Oliver, doing an enormous amount of historical research and driving into that sort of 2-pathway structure the sorts of new feminist historiographies that were being developed and were being published at that crucial period during the mid to late 70s, when people like Edna Ryan and Anne Curthoys were doing absolutely groundbreaking historical research. And we were able to draw on that and punch that into that 2-part timeline, which I think was the original contribution of For Love or Money, to bring those 2 things together and to make a sort of 200-year plus narrative structure.
Well, you also had an analysis, you see, behind the film.
That's right. That's right. That was a kind of meta level that was being developed out of our increasing familiarity with the historical research and the arguments that came out of that, and trying to find a coherent narrative to bring it all together.
It's really interesting, because there's what Martha just said about historical analysis. It's true of probably all of the films we're talking about today. Brazen Hussies.
We Aim to Please is a little bit different.
It's more, it's in the anarchic tradition, or the experimental tradition.
It is, and We Aim to Please had a different, its process was quite different, had nothing to do with the archive. It had nothing to do with history books. It did have to do with the reading that we were doing, because what we did, how we made it was we had, we wrote a little script and got a tiny bit of money, and then things happened and we didn't do anything with it, and they were going to take the money away, so we thought we'd do something. I really wish I had that original script. It's disappeared a long time ago. What we did was we brought our shoeboxes of things that were important to us, to each other, and we sat down and we opened our shoeboxes, and it had photographs in it, it had poems, it had quotes from, you know, and a lot of those quotes would have been from feminists, because this is what we were reading at the time. So
Robin Laurie said that you were like magpies.
Yes,
we were magpies.
Like magpies. We were. And we were just taking bits and pieces. And then I started working in film. I started working as a camera assistant, and I'd bring the cameras home. I was working, John Hughes was making a film about the Communist Party menace, about Menzies. And I was the assistant, and I'd bring the camera home, and I'd ring Robin up and say, I've got the camera this weekend. And we'd meet and we'd say, well, and she'd say, well, what about we do this bit? I go, okay. And I'd film it, and she'd just bring something out and offer it to me, or I'd bring something out and offer it to her. And, you know, it was such a sort of, it was our area of exploration was the female body and sexual desire and how we felt about our bodies. And so it was a looking at our bodies, but it was also all those inspirational quotes, those, you know, people like John Berger, who there's those close-up lips that's in Brazen Hussies. Women have been depicted in quite a different way from men. That's John Berger. And we hadn't...
Ways of seeing.
Yeah, ways of seeing. We hadn't read Laura Mulvey. We wouldn't have made the film if we had. We would have been too scared. We'd do something wrong. We were a bit scared about all those feminists in the academy, you know, who were sort of. So we were theatre actors, and so the film is very performative, and we just kind of put out there how we felt about things and picked up the things that were to hand, to show, to play with, and then. I made a film out of it. We made a film out of it in the editing room. So it had a different kind of development. It was more anarchic. It was very instinctive. And it came out of a friendship. And I loved what Robin... I'm so sorry Robin isn't here for this discussion, because it would have been beautiful if she had been. But I love what she says in Brazen Hussies about how when she and I met, we had that zing that happens when you meet a friend. And it was a really passionate friendship. And we discovered the depths of feminism together. We'd come across feminism, but we read books, we exchanged books, we exchanged ideas, we brought images to each other, we inspired each other, we made each other laugh, and we made a film with it, with bits and pieces and odds and ends, you know. So it was different.
Jeni,
yeah, I have to...
Jeni was saying something about archives, which I just...
No, I was more... trying to make a link, acknowledging what Margot said about the making of We Aim to Please is a very different journey, but I am interested to come back to that point that I was trying to make a link between what Megan was saying about For Love or Money and the development of an analysis through the process of writing that very particular script based on research. Just let me get the thought out, and then I'll finish. Is that I saw this link as Megan was speaking to Film for Discussion, because I think that there was a lot of historical analysis in that film that was driving the nature of that film, that actually didn't so much come from me, because I was a lost soul, actually, if you want the truth. So I think the historical analysis in Film for Discussion was coming from you, which is, I think, why you're credited as the director of the film.
I don't know why.
Well, that's another,
because I organise things, and
that's another discussion. But I think that.
But the thing is, everybody did contribute.
No, I'm talking about the analysis in the film. That's what interests me. That
but it's underneath. Yeah, it's not on the top.
It's underneath. It's underneath. Well, it's about a journey that this character is making towards understanding her position in both the family and in a patriarchal society. And there's an analysis of that going on, and all of the scenes in the office, and then in the drive in the car home to the dinner, and then the dinner scene, and then the discussion at the washing up, and then at the mirror. They're all stepping stones to women trying to come, in that period, trying to come to an understanding of what in the hell is going on here in my life. That's what I think. The mother's trying to understand. The son is trying to understand when the father picks on him and says, when are you going to get your hair cut? The father's drunk. He picks on the son. It's a direct scene out of My Family Life. So, you know, there is this analysis going on about what is it that oppresses women. And I think why We Aim to Please is so interesting in the companion package of films or body of work that are segueing around Brazen Hussies, is because it takes this other approach in, as Margot was describing, about the body and sexuality and desire. And, you know, I want to just make, you know, I might be hosting my own petard, but I just want to say, for me, Maidens was a really important film in that, for me as a filmmaker, in that whole journey as well to self-understanding, because it was a journey into the self. And that's where the personal is political really becomes like this.
But it was more than that.
Feminism.
It was more than that. Through the journey to the self, it was an opening into a much wider history.
Well, of all sorts of things that oppress women, and how one navigates that journey, both collectively and individually. And that's where I think the personal is political is so fundamental to the journey of liberation.
Definitely. I was going to say all three films are quite different forms of filmmaking, and that feminist filmmaking and the women's liberation movement itself, and this is quoting you actually, Margot, from an essay you wrote, was that it offered women an analysis of male power and female subjectivity, and that the feminist filmmaking was creating a different way and creating different images of women than those that were offered by dominant white male patriarchy. You know, so the consciousness raising women, realising that they weren't living up to this idea of femininity that wasn't created from women's lives, it was put upon women. And that was epitomised by, well, you know, that women should be happy at home and should, you know, I mean, it's like, it's the capitalist nuclear family kind of thing that's put upon women. It wasn't natural and it hadn't been around for that long. But I think We Aim to Please is really interesting in the way it's sort of, I suppose, from reading John Berger, but you kind of, before Laura Mulvey's essay came out, which had a huge impact on me when I was at first year uni studying cinema, was that you connected what John Berger was saying with like Hollywood's creation of images of women, and you were directly challenging the male gaze. And I just remember being blown away when I first saw We Aim to Please, because it was so brilliantly playing with that male gaze.
Don't be mistaken,
Hollywood
We Aim to
films
Please did have a historical background. I'm thinking about, you know, we put out little zines, magazines, before we made We Aim to Please. We were reprinting essays by Emma Goldman, by Alexander Kollontai, by, you know, we were reprinting stuff. We were putting ideas out which were about feminism. And We Aim to Please was the third issue of As If, actually.
I just want to say something that in trying to really understand Women of Steel, because we presented it to a history mob, I tried to understand what it was, and this is true for all these other films. Antonio Gramsci wrote about, he had a concept of the organic intellectual who writes from within the class, or you could say within the gender. Whereas the official sort of national histories come from outside. And so all of these films, Brazen Hussies and the three films and Women of Steel, they're all made by organic intellectuals. In fact, Robin worked in the steelworks for 30 years, you know, you can't get closer than that. So, and that gives them all a very different character. So I just wanted to put that in.
I wanted to say one other thing about For Love or Money too, because I think
I haven't even got to my actual questions about For Love or Money yet. So please don't think I don't have. I just wanted to quickly talk about We Aim to Please, and then I have questions about For Love or Money. So one thing that I find really powerful about We Aim to Please is the just how, I said this at the screening that I did a Q&A with Rob and Laurie, but just how powerful the female nude body is when presented in the way that you did in We Aim to Please, which was not created by the male gaze and not for the male gaze, and how threatening that could be. I wonder if you could talk about that, Margot.
Well, I think throwing tomatoes at the camera and, you know, doing all of those things, we were trying to smash through that, you know, hegemony of the male gaze. That's what our intent was, but in a sort of playful way too.
Very fun, very playful, but also very powerful. And I think that's what really excites me, is just how playful and fun it is, but also how threatening it is. And often when you see female sexuality, you know, controlled by women themselves, depicted on screen, it is very threatening. I wonder what you think about that.
Make women laugh. We wanted to, we were directing it to women, and I think men didn't quite know how to deal with it at all. And I think young women don't know quite how to deal with it at all these days, because we had a big bushy pubes and they all shaved theirs off. Ginny girls, it's gorgeous and you'll lose it later. So wonderful. Anyway, that kind of just to show our bodies and to speak about our bodies and to discuss our bodies, I think that was, what can I say? I think we egged each other on, and I don't think I would have done it on my own. I don't know that Robin would have done it on her own. Somehow or other it was the chemistry between us. One egged the other one on, and we just kept going for it. And it still makes me laugh. And I think that to give women a female audience pleasure in our you know, showing of ourselves and discussing of the female body and female sexuality, that was our intention.
Fabulous. And now to For Love or Money, which, you know, is such a huge achievement of filmmaking, of historical filmmaking, and of discovering a history that hadn't been told yet. I get a lot of feedback. I've been getting a lot of feedback on Brazen Hussies from people that are just so amazed they didn't know this history. And that was one of my goals, was to create an opportunity for an awakening of women's history, because I mean, the reason I made it was that I was getting told by people my age that they didn't need to call themselves feminists anymore. It was all done with. And they didn't know anything about the movement. So I wonder, was that the goal with For Love or Money? I wonder if you could talk about what, you know, how it started, and you've talked about how you made it and the two narratives and going through the archive, but what was the initial motivation?
Well, actually, it was a Labour conference at Macquarie University in 79. 78, that several of us presented our films there, and previous films. Margot Oliver showed her film, I can't remember the name.
Charlene
Does Met at Uni, and I screened Maidens and
Moondust, Charlene something Moondust.
Yeah,
there's two. And out of that,
Moon Age Daydreams or something, Charlene Stardust, something like that.
Yeah, that's it.
You got it.
But of the screening of those films, a request came through some of the women at the screening who were academics working in, you know, feminist academics working in history and economics, that we really need a film about the history of women and labour in Australia, that there wasn't one. That was the original kind of impulse that came to us directly at that conference. As filmmakers, it's a bit like carrying the legacy of Sydney Women's Film Group and the academics seeing a couple of us there at those conferences, because we'd go to those conferences, seeing us as the filmmakers who could make the films that were needed at that historical moment. They say, we really need a film about women and labour. And I started discussing that with Margot Oliver very early on, and then I started to meet with Megan, and another woman was involved called Sandra Alexander. The three of us all met. I myself was incredibly interested in making found footage films, and Maidens is a found footage film totally, and in that tradition of making films entirely from found footage from archives, whether they're personal archives or feminist archives or national archives. And I was drawn to develop and work on a film that was made from found footage material from the archive. And I just jumped at the opportunity to be able to go down and research the history of Australian film through the lens of women in labour. And that's how we started. From my perspective, Megan would have probably her own take and her own moment where she became involved, and subsequently when Margot became involved.
Well, I think you invited me to be involved, Jen, and my interest evolved out of my prior work in video. I'd been involved in what you'd probably call now social action video work that was being done immediately prior to starting work on For Love or Money through Film Australia, the old Commonwealth Film Unit, which became Film Australia in the early 70s as the government film production, documentary production house. And my interest was in the history and also in archival work, but it came probably mostly from a motivation to make a work that would be useful to the movement in that time, and probably for my own education as well, because I hadn't studied history, and it was interesting to me to think about delving back into 200 years plus of Australian history and trying to find a form for the story of women coming through that history. So I'd say that was my background.
There was some very, I mean, there's so much to learn in the film, but a couple of things that really blew my mind because I didn't know them was it was fascinating to learn how so many women were brought over from Britain to be domestic servants, and how they preferred to go and work in factories because they had much more independence. That really was fascinating to me, and to see how the depiction of the young Aboriginal girl with the white babies and the sort of propaganda narrative saying how Aboriginal girls make great domestic
Child
carers. Narabula. And then also in terms of the steelworkers, that really fascinating piece of on the street interview with a woman who worked at the steelworks in World War II, and it was she says it was much easier than working in the textile mills. And that was fascinating because, you know, that's often used as an excuse to deny women work in industries like that it's too hard, it's too grimy. And yet that fine work in the textile factories.
I think the other thing that's really, I think that one of the great contributions For Love or Money makes is to the discussion implicit in the whole film on women and labour, both in the home and in the paid workforce. We worked really hard to develop that without diminishing women's work in the home as and also without romanticising it or glorifying it, but to honour women's work. I became particularly interested in that, how to honour women's work in the home.
I think that was your great contribution to the film, Jen. And just looking at it again today, that subjective voice that keeps being threaded through, it makes an absolutely original contribution to the film. It makes it really different than
that's what makes it a
labour history film.
This film, For Love or Money, is really different from most history films because it has that strong, poetic, subjective voice in it.
And we had to work really hard to achieve that. We had our own personal struggles with each other to kind of like get the space to kind of like find the way for that to happen. I mean, it was really complicated.
And to find the images to support.
And to find the images.
Yeah,
That's
I
right.
bet.
And so that was, you know, there was me and Jeni and Megan in the editing room. And, you know, often it took hours for us to make decisions about things because everybody had to have their say. And so whatever, we had the collective process. But it was wonderful too. And, you know, what I wanted to say before was how much I learnt when I did For Love or Money. I mean, I came in later as the editor, and Jeni and Megan and Margot invited me to come in as the editor, I think on the basis of We Aim to Please, because I'd edited We Aim to Please. And it just happened at the right moment in my life when I was a bit lost, and I went, yes, I'd love to do that, and I'm interested and I'm curious. But I had no idea that it was my history lesson. I mean, I didn't go to university. I went as a mature age student to university, but I didn't go as an undergrad. And, you know, to me, that history was completely new to me. Even if I'd gone to university, I would have learned it anyway. But the big thing for me was when huge, all the feminist stuff, but the Indigenous stuff, the Aboriginal stuff. And the editing room was in Redfern. And we were all involved with the Sydney Filmmakers Co-op, and there were Aboriginal filmmakers in the Sydney Filmmakers Co-op. And our work to make sure that story of what had happened to Aboriginal women and the work of Aboriginal women was through the film from the very beginning right up until the present, which was, you know, 82, 83 when we finished. But how we worked to try to make sure that that voice was there as well. And that was a huge learning experience for me. I started reading Henry Reynolds, looking at all the Baldwin Spencer photos. You know, I was living in Redfern. It was a huge sort of education for me. And it was a huge education to learn about the history of women's struggle for equal pay. And for, you know, it was, you know, a huge gift that I was invited to work with that material. And I agree with Megan about the we voice, you know, that Jeni wrote. You know, we were the ones who, you know, had blood on our hands. We were the ones who were that personal voice narration created another level within the film to actually go deeper emotionally, I think. And that was, and as an editor, trying to find images to make that work, that was thrilling.
And it's very well edited. This is the thing.
Yes.
And Margot, it's mysterious because you hadn't ever done anything of that dimension.
No, I'd only ever cut We Aim to Please.
Well, then how did they know that you could do the job that you did, which was very good?
Well, they had done incredible research, and you can see that. So you had found so much. There must have been
the rhythm.
It's incredible. It's an incredible job.
Because of We Aim to Please, and I guess I was a feminist and I was around, you know, I don't know. It was a huge thing to be asked to do, and I'm really glad I said yes.
A most beautiful job that I'm struck by every time I see the film, the rhythm and the pacing and the little touches that Margot brought to shaping that archival material with the music, with the beautiful music by Elizabeth Drake, which
fantastic.
It's another level to the film, which is quite extraordinary, I think. But Margot's art in the editing makes the film at one whole level that you can't sort of deny.
And it's still such a relevant film today. I mean, it's still such an important history that kids today at schools still need to watch it, I think. And I do want to talk about the way you chose to tell it with the narration by Noni Hazelhurst and the we, I think is really interesting. And I certainly struggled editing Brazen Hussies. I didn't want to have a narrator. I wanted the women to tell the story themselves, but I thought it was really interesting how you chose, I'm sure you struggled with that as well, and you did a lot of interviews with people, but you chose to have one narrator, but that we was such a great narrative device. for telling the story. But I wonder if it was difficult in terms of incorporating Aboriginal women and migrant women, because I know for me, I certainly didn't want to speak for Aboriginal women and say that they were part of the movement if they themselves didn't feel that they were. So
it has. I thought you did really well in showing the different positions and the conflicts and things in Brazen Hussies. I thought, fantastic, Catherine, because it wasn't all just roses, and it wasn't, everybody wasn't, I think the Aboriginal women had another struggle that they were very much involved with, and it didn't, the paths didn't cross. I thought you showed that extremely well.
I was really interested in telling more of what Aboriginal women were doing, because they certainly were organising in their own communities and doing amazing things, and it was difficult to find women who are still alive to talk about it, but there's certainly a whole film that could be made out of that. I don't know if I'm really the person to do it, but I'm certainly interested. There's so much more that could be said about that, I think.
I just agree with everything about Brazen Hussies that you're saying. It's great, that diversity that you show and the conflicts, and the Aboriginal voice is really strong, the way it articulates that it's not part of that movement in that way. But just coming back to the we voice in For Love or Money, there was a lot of critique about that voice after the film was completed. There are a number of essays that critique it that are interesting and thoughtful. Felicity Collins.
Critical of it.
Very critical.
Well, I thought it was a really brilliant way to have a narration that's not a voice of God authority, that's a collective we. I thought that was really...
That was the intention.
Well done.
I actually think historically it holds, and it represents that. It might be slightly utopian, but it represents a kind of a movement that came together to achieve certain goals and aims, and I think that we voice attempts to represent that. And then there's a she voice as well, and then there's an I voice. There's a number of strategies around voice in the film that actually work together with the we voice.
That's right. She must keep her mind on the work. She must keep working. She must. That's right. Yeah,
and that was highly conscious.
That's great.
But I'm interested in the critique of the time, and I think for people who might see this interview online, that they can read those historical debates about the film, and they're really interesting for filmmakers to consider as well, about how you contemplate the voice of the film. Can you have you can't speak on behalf of other people, like the curator at the time for Australian Screen Online, who wrote I've forgotten her name. Margot, you might remember, she wrote the fairly critical perspective.
Collins?
Was it Adrian Parr?
The Aboriginal woman filmmaker, writer.
Romaine, did she write it?
Romaine
Morton.
Romaine Morton.
Yeah, at the time, Australian Screen Online, the National Film and Sound Archives website, if there was a film with Aboriginal content, or it was a film directed by Aboriginal people, they would have an Aboriginal curator who would write curators' comments alongside a non-Aboriginal writer. And For Love or Money was written, the comments are by Romaine Morton, and she critiqued the we voice, as I recall, and she also critiqued the film for trying to speak about Aboriginal women on their behalf as white women, as white women. And I think that, there's some really interesting arguments that she uses. And
but gee, you could have really gone for us if we hadn't.
Yeah, that's true.
If we had left Aboriginal women out,
how could we not?
How could we? How could we leave them out? We had to include them.
I'm just thinking if you look at Romaine's work that she developed herself, I think it's called 1000 Beats, where she's done a performative piece, theatrical piece, where she performs as a poet. With behind her is the history of the representation of Aboriginal people in film, and she's addressing that in a performance. Then I think her critique of For Love or Money is just a stepping stone for her to develop her own really strong...
Her own voice.
And I just think those ideas it's all part of the rich mix of, you make a work and you put it out there, and there's all these different responses. And they all have validity.
But I find it interesting that all of the films that we're discussing and have made, including the 2 recent ones, they all have different forms. And it's almost as if the subject matter and the intentions just find the form. And also circumstances, you know, what you've got, what you've got, what your budget is. And there isn't any, what interests me is I don't think there's any feminist film form at all, actually. Anyway.
It's everything, and it can be in any form.
I think I just wanted to go back to For Love of Money for a second, because we really struggled with with telling the film chronologically. There were many discussions around the chronology. How could we break that? It's like the dead hand of history. This happened and then that happened and then this happened and then that happened. We really, really beat our brains against the wall trying to think of other ways of telling the story, and so that it wasn't that sort of this happened and then that happened. And I think that's where the We Voice really helps to create another a very deep texture to the film, but we never found a way. We never found a way to break the chronology.
Well, there's a lot of repetition of themes.
Well, there are moments where there are montages, Margot, that reiterate or take you back to moments. Previous moments that does break the chronology and is a reflection of, you know, thematic or visual ideas that have come through the film. I think that's quite an interesting technique that we use to sort of.
I do.
This is the same chronology that, and I know we did struggle with it, and there was no real easy solution. But it's only through that chronology that one is able to actually really represent the repetition of history.
Yeah.
And a very particular repetition of history that continues to oppress women, and you can see it at work today. You know, it hasn't gone away. All of those factors are still at work that continue to oppress women, and you could just look at, say, COVID and the impact on women and work.
Yeah.
And COVID, restructuring the economy and the role of male work in restructuring the economy in, you know, 2020.
There's something about Brazen Hussies and Women of Steel in particular being made today, which is that it's not actually, neither of those films is about women being oppressed.
It's about women fighting.
It's about,
oppression.
You know, and I think it's...
Well, Women of Steel was about the kind of, it was about how women couldn't get in, how they worked to get in, and then they were thrown out, and then it's about women's struggle, but it's.
But it doesn't have that feeling of downtrodden. I don't think it's because they stood up.
No, it's very uplifting.
But I would say that's the same. You know, with Brazen Hussies, it's all about how women did
in Brazen Hussies.
You know, confront things and do something. So.
I was going to say I really love a cyclical narrative structure, and Maya Deren's Meshes of the Afternoon was a narrative form that was really groundbreaking and certainly blew my mind when I saw it. And, I can definitely tell that David Lynch has been influenced by
But Maya Deren, you reckon?
Yeah, I think so, definitely. Her cyclical structure and the dreaming, and anyway, that's off topic. On topic, Rosie Jones and I certainly struggled with finding the structure for Brazen Hussies. Chronology was something that at least we could hold on to and not just be cast adrift in so much sea of information. You know, at least it was one thing that I could point to and say, well, that didn't happen until this happened. But I mean, it's not chronological really, but at least chronology kept me tethered to some kind of form.
You mentioned Rosie did a fantastic job.
She did. Had to be chronological, because had it not been for things that happened leading up to that struggle and the things that happened in the struggle, that picture of how to have a victorious campaign, although there's some down moments, wouldn't have been true. I mean, the chronology can be very important, because had the women's movement not pushed the Labor Party in New South Wales into anti-discrimination legislation, had Neville Wran not, seen it through.
It's really hard to see causality without chronology.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's what I
really hard. And I think that's why you find so many films end up working on a film now, I'm struck by how you can't escape the linear nature of the film. It just informs you all the time. You're stuck with it. It is linear. You can talk about non-linear editing, but it's still linear.
But I think you're right about the causality, because it's the difference between this happened and then that happened, this happened and then that happened. The difference between this happened, but this happened. This happened, therefore this happened. This happened, therefore women rose up. But this came back, therefore. So it's but and therefore you've got to bring into that discussion.
Exactly. And then when you've got the opportunity to do that visually, which is what film is giving you, and I think in the scenes in For Love or Money where we were able to document why women's work in the home started to define how women's work in the workforce manifested, because you saw women, the way we'd do those montages of women serving in the home, and then you'd cut to seeing women doing the sandwiches in the cafe or the bread shop, or polishing, washing the trains, as cleaners. And you'd cut backwards and forwards, as we did, between those two poles, and you see it visually, and you start to see how women's work in the home is completely reinforcing that sex segmentation.
Totally, yeah.
And which I suppose the Wollongong film is actually challenging the very basis of sex segmentation in the workforce. Now, we can do those jobs. There's no reason why we can't. We did them in World War II, we can do them now.
Can I just read out something that I jotted down when I was looking at the film again today, which jumped out at me as a kind of key piece of narration. And I think it's the first time that we as filmmakers place ourselves in the film, in that historical chronology, which I have to say was one of the huge gifts of the film to me, to understand that I was living in historical time and that there was a before and then we were moving into the future, influenced so much by what came before. But the line is, we discovered how our work in the home determines the sort of jobs we could get, how those jobs were low paid, how we worked for love, not money. We named it the work of loving, and that's where that link is made. And that's the thread that runs right through the film, the conjunction, or rather the twin influences between paid work in the workforce and unpaid work in the home, and the effects and limitations that has placed on women historically through that time. I think that was a big breakthrough for the film to find that sort of argument that we could then run right through up until the present time. And we still have it now.
Very importantly,
that I was thinking of when I said that about the images between paid work and that was exactly that line, that voice. It's interesting that you re-looked at the film today. That narration, it's great. I love it.
One of the things I like about that film, though, is it validates so-called women's work in the home. To me, it absolutely validates it, and I think that that's very important. But we were talking about that in the early 70s, actually.
Yeah, well, actually, I was going to say something that I don't think I really got a chance to cover in Brazen Hussies, but it was brought up at a Q&A. Somebody stood up and said, I was turned off by the women's movement because of their attitude to children and mothers. And I think what you just said, Megan, is something that For Love or Money does, is something that is still so relevant today. We still haven't figured out how to honour and value the unpaid work of loving.
I think that was fake news back then. That was cliche. I'm sorry, but it was like
I think there really was a huge division.
Clung to feminism. you know, oh, they're all bra-burning man haters, and, you know, there's all of that stuff. The cliches that surrounded feminism was that they were anti-motherhood, and it wasn't true.
Well, sometimes it was true, Margot. I had the child and children in that situation, and of course, sometimes it was true. There were all sorts of people, and people who made that criticism picked the people they wanted to criticize, didn't look at the other, you know.
Yeah, I mean, for the first time, women were released because of birth control, were saying we don't have to have children, and then as a result were exploring completely different ways of living that didn't involve having children, and that certainly was having a huge impact on discussions of what it is to be a woman and what a woman's role should be. So, I mean, I'm going to read out my question now because it covers all of this. Women's role as mother is quite complex in the women's movement. Many women renounced, in a way, maternity and having children, yet there were many who already had children or did go on to have children. And something that is dealt with so brilliantly in For Love or Money is recognising and honouring the work of loving that women do. And the work of loving that women do is not just with children. It's with parents. It's the work of caring for others. And this work of loving is woefully undervalued in society, and it's something that
as women, actually, the whole volunteer workforce today in our culture that underpins caring for elders and children, particularly elders, and it will become more of an issue as more of our generation becomes more frail. The people who are doing that care work tend to all be volunteers, and they're all women. I'm in one of the volunteer care groups at the moment. It's pretty much all women. It's extraordinary. Where are the men? What happened to them? Don't they want to do that kind of care work? Don't they want to do that? Because it's so outside of the ken of paid work and prestige.
Yeah.
It's called nursing shit and sheets. You know, that's the work of loving, actually. It's shit and sheets. It's cleaning up the mess and doing it in a loving way. That's what bringing up little babies is about. You know, I was very involved with my sister's children. She had 4 daughters while we were making For Love or Money, and I was very involved in helping her with the children. My contribution to the film about the work of loving came from being grounded with her, doing that. I used to go from the edit room back to the mountains where she was living and help. And, you know, I was really reading all that feminist theory as well about the double day and the importance to capitalism of women being the unpaid labour force, unrecognised. And how to challenge that is really hard. Even today, how to challenge that is really hard.
And, you know, I mean, when women think that they have the same rights as men now in terms of the workplace, even though we still don't have equal pay, I think it is this work of loving where we still need a lot to be done in society. You know, Mel talks about how you'd never see a man holding a baby walking down the street, and then you see the shots of men, and a lot of people are moved by that in Brazen Hussies. And that has changed. That's something that has shifted a lot. But I mean, Martha, you commented on it when I interviewed you about how it wasn't just about getting jobs and being in high positions of power. It's about, you know, in the home as well.
Yes, I did. And I just remember something that happened during the women's movement. Somebody was brought to Australia to show what women could achieve, and her name was Sharon Lord. I've never forgotten it. She had a very high position in the US Pentagon. So, you know, some of this, there's a whole rethinking of work, of the purpose, of the nature of society, and that links with environment. But it's such a stiff paradigm. It's been put on top of women. You know, and it's very difficult. It's very difficult. And, you know, Jeni and I have daughters that are struggling with little children and they want to do their work.
But the structure is so entrenched. It's so interesting to have 2 daughters, or one stepdaughter and a daughter with children, and to see their struggle to both work and care for their families and do that in today's world, they're up against it. And that's when I think, well, what's really changed? All this, I mean, some things have changed. That I think what's great about Brazen Hussies is that it documents those changes. That, you know, the equal pay movement, the movement around single mothers that the film represents, I think is fantastic. The abortion campaign, all of the campaigns that your film follows and unpacks shows that a lot has been achieved. So I don't want to diminish the fact that a lot has been achieved through collective action and consciousness. But the old nexus of women's oppression in the home, particularly it's around when you have children, and it's a very difficult thing to unhinge.
Well, I think we have definitely gone over time, but this has been such a great conversation, and I think we should do this on a regular basis. What a great, I love being able to talk about my film and your films, which had such a huge impact on the making of Brazen Hussies and continue to have a huge impact on our understanding of how we got here today and how we can make change.
And well done, Catherine. The film is doing so well. It's screening all over the place. It's so fantastic. And I think the team has did such a great work. Rosie, I want to just have a big shout out for Rosie, what she did editing. It was really fantastic. And, you know, you've got a great team there of producers who've been supporting you. And I'm astonished. It's just everywhere. And I wanted to see it in every school.
Me too. Well, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
I think that's a wrap.